Welcome back to another amazing episode of The Art of Outsmarting with the legendary Keith Mitnick. Thank you so much for doing this. This is great. We've talked a lot about how you've made the abstract pain and suffering sorts of damages very concrete. How are they susceptible to biases, and how do you combat that?
They are extraordinarily susceptible to bias. I think more so than anything else in a trial, in a civil trial.
As opposed to like medical bill damages.
Yeah, or who's right or wrong. Why? Who's right or wrong is a yes or no answer. It's black or white. Someone says, he said, she said. Said, you pulled out in front of me. No, you didn't. I had the light. No, you had the light. He said, she said. Who had the green light? Who had the red light? Someone's right and someone's wrong. If the evidence shows the defendant ran the light, probably not the plaintiff, is someone going to say, you know what, I don't like these lawsuits, I'm just going to say the opposite? I guess someone could, but is it likely? Nah. So if you're fighting over something that is a yes or no, thumbs up, thumbs down, black and white, bias can come into play. Why? Because there's believability of witnesses. And you may be less inclined to believe the person suing than the person being sued. So is it free of bias? Absolutely not. But is it less vulnerable or susceptible? Yes, it is. Yes and no questions are less vulnerable than what? When you're valuing something. If you're going to put a value on something, there is no black and white answer. It's an assessment. How do you take your bias out of an assessment? Think about the analogy I used at the beginning of jury selection that we've talked about in other episodes about I'm not crazy about cherry pie. If it was a competition, it came down to two pies, one cherry, one apple, and just so happens that I'm picked out of the audience to be randomly to be the judge. And it just so happens I'm not crazy about cherry pie. I bite into the cherry pie, my lip curls a little. I can't help it, I'm wired that way. I bite into the apple pie, no lip curling. If the apple pie sucked and the cherry pie was like doing somersaults backwards, it was perfect, I'd overcome the bias. But the closer it gets, how do I take out of when I'm going, you know what, these are pretty close, I'm going to give the nod to the cherry pie that when I bit into it, my lip curled? What's the likelihood of that? Not very good. When you're assessing and evaluating, valuing something on a sliding scale, not a flip a switch, how do you take bias out of the picture? The most honest person in the world, trying their best. How do you just remove it from the equation? For most people, that's beyond their human capabilities. It's not about fairness. It's about you're asking too much of them. That's why. And I'll tell you a story where this has come up. Because remember, this is a matter that's contested. And if you have a contested matter that involves valuing, and you have a personal preference to start with as to one side's valuation versus the other, I don't want to be involved in a large verdict. I don't want to be associated with $1 million verdict. I don't want to tell my friends, neighbors, coworkers, loved ones, I signed off on one. And we're saying the facts and evidence support $1 million verdict. And the other side says not even close. How do you take that out of the process? It's really difficult. Here's a real story. Example happened one of the last, if not the last trials. It didn't go to verdict because we ran out of jurors. We had a bunch of jurors who honored the process and acknowledged their biases, and we had 40 jurors and we couldn't seat a jury and we couldn't come back the next day because we wouldn't have enough time to finish the trial. So it ended up we have to come back and retry it.
Wow.
But we had a judge there, and he was a very good judge. Very good judge.
What makes a very good judge? Just curious.
A guy that's fair, follows the law, understands the law, does his best to get it right, or her best to get it right. Whether they agree with me every time isn't how I determine is a good judge or not. They care about it getting it right. They don't have a favoritism, and they are smart enough to be able to assess the information presented and make the best call they can. A lot of the calls are hard. They aren't just crystal clear. And this is a really good judge, smart person, cares, very professional. But he did something surprised me. I had asked a question right before lunch of this group of 40 jurors, how many people do not want to be associated with a verdict? We're going to be talking about millions of dollars for pain and suffering. How many of you don't want to be associated with a verdict of that size? Even if the evidence supports it, you don't believe in it. Don't want to tell your family, coworkers, all that. And because of that bias against it, you cannot assure the court you can't lay that bias aside. It may come into play over and above the evidence.
Such a genius question.
Over and above the evidence. You're not going to ignore the evidence. You're not going to put your fingers in your ears. But after the evidence comes, you cannot assure the court that it'll be based solely on the evidence of the law, because it may be the evidence of the law plus the bias having a hard to put aside impact. How many of you say, and I don't remember how many, but, like, let's say 6, 7, 8 people for cause on that. The other side, on a break, the judge was, because we were trying to get it all done, and he needed to know, did we need to bring up new jurors from below? They had some holdovers down below, in the room below, and so he encouraged us to get together. So we talked, and they didn't agree to all of them, but they agreed to like 6 of them. So we presented it, said these 6 people, the defense agrees, those are called valid challenge for cause. And to my surprise, this extraordinarily good judge said he agreed on like 2 of them or 3 of them, but there were a couple of them he didn't. 2, 3, 4 of them he didn't. I don't remember the exact number. He said, okay, well, I deny on those. I said, Judge, they agree. He says, well, I'm the decider. I said, yes, sir. And I was really, he said, I believe, and he wasn't being, he doesn't have an unfair bone in his body, and he's a smart guy. So I wasn't worried I'm getting screwed because he's just trying to seat a jury. Not that kind of judge. Not in a million years. So I knew he really meant it. And he said, I think they didn't fully understand. And I said, Judge, they said this. I know what they said. I was taking notes. You don't need to repeat it. And I said, well, how's that not cost? Because he said it's a complicated subject. And he said, but you absolutely, when you come back from lunch, can ask more questions. And I thought,
fascinating.
And I said, can I don't want to argue with you because I really respect this judge. I said, but can I lay something out for you? He said, sure. And I laid out what I'm about. And I've started, and I laid out for him the distinction between the two. Kind of like we talked about. It's not yes or no. It's he goes, they're very good points, and you are welcome to make them to the jury, and I'll listen very closely to the answers. And I thought, okay. And I went away going, we don't have enough peremptory challenges. We're going to have some of those people on this jury. And I came back and I laid it out for the jury. And that's what is the impetus for me talking about this. Because I want to tell you kind of what I said to the jury here in a minute. Because I basically said the same thing I did to the judge, but to the jurors when they came back. And I listed everyone he didn't grant on. I said, I want to ask you a few follow-up. I want to make sure there's no confusion. Remember you told me so-and-so, yes. I said, let me explain why it's so susceptible. And I'm going to go into that for you in a minute. But I'm telling the audience, I'm going to go into that in a minute. But for right now, I want to finish that part of the story. And I did it. And I said, do you understand that difference? Yes. Do you stand by your earlier answer that you could not assure the court your decision based solely on the evidence? It may be the evidence plus that bias against being associated with a verdict like that, in spite of your best effort to put it aside. Yes. Does it make sense to you even more so now that I've explained it? Yes, it does. I said, okay. And I was thinking, do I approach and say, is that enough? And before I could say it, this judge said, gentleman approach. He said, you don't need to ask any more questions. I'm granting them. So I went away going, I need to share with folks that explanation, because not only did it help with the jury, it took a brilliant judicial mind who, for whatever reason, thought there was some confusion. And I know it was a sincere thought. I didn't agree, but, we're in a courtroom seeing things different. But any potential confusion with the jurors was completely erased with that explanation in the judge's mind. So I realized there's a twofold power to that explanation. It'll help. I already had the jurors, in my mind, given its cause challenge, valid. But it did. You could see people nodding and going. And the judge then saw there's clarity. So I thought, this is worth me using more, and if I'm going to use it, I'd love to tell other people. So basically, here's what I said to the jury on it. And some of this will be repeat, but it's worth saying. I said, folks, before lunch, you said this. I said, I want to explain to you why I'm asking those questions. Why am I asking you whether that bias could come into play? I said, I want you to think about something. If we're talking about, was someone right or wrong, do they run a red light or not run a red light? Bias can come into play, but it's less likely. If you listen to the evidence and say, look, they ran the red light, is it really going to keep you from saying they ran a red light? Probably not. Unless someone's really being dishonest. And I'm not asking any about dishonest people. I'm asking about the human nature of how when you have a bias against something. By the way, I'm going to pause 1 second. People are scared to ask say bias. You're okay at the beginning when you do the pie story or whatever story you're doing. I just throw in, I got a bit of a bias against cherry pie. Once you've said that, you take the stigma away from the word bias. I say I don't mean hateful, mean-spirited kind. I'm talking about human nature. You got feelings against it might impact you. People will say, yeah, I got a bias against it. So don't be scared of bias as long as you frame it correctly.
Nice.
So, and once the jurors say bias out of their own lips, the judge is more likely to grant it. So I used to pussyfoot around bias. I don't anymore. So anyhow, back to this. I said you said you had the bias, but if someone has a bias and we're using something where you're assessing and weighing, it can be really hard to separate it because it's on a scale. And if you're starting out saying, I don't want it to be of a higher value, I don't believe in it, and I present you evidence, and there is not going to be a formula, you get to decide. And you have every right to decide. But if you come to the decision-making process and you already have decided I don't want to go there, how do you extract that out of the process? Because there's no rule that says you can't make it lower. You absolutely can reject whatever suggestion I make to you. I'm going to make some suggestion. I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to back it up. And I'm going to hope that you see the wisdom and reasonableness of what I say. But you don't have to. Absolutely don't have to. It's your collective wisdom. But when those are the rules, and you say, I'm telling you up front, I got a bias against it and don't want to go there. I don't even believe in it. How's it not come into play? You don't have to accept it. But the purpose of this is not to have a bias being part of the process. And you're telling me there's a bias may have a process. I said, here's an example. It's like if someone were going to buy a house. If you're not crazy about the style of the house, you're less likely to pay the same amount as you would for one you like the style. And you could see all the jurors going. I said, that's the point of it. So do you understand what I'm getting at, why I'm asking you this? I do. So with that explanation, do you stand by your answer that you cannot assure the court your decision to be based solely on the evidence of the law? Because it may, in honesty, be the evidence in the law plus that bias against coming into play. You can't just separate it given the nature. So does that answer stand? Yes. They all said yes. more emphatically, and this time the judge, without me asking, brought us up and he was done with it. They're cause challenges. Now, we ended up running out of jurors, but I'd rather run out of jurors than try a case and ask for what I thought was a very righteous, valid, fair number that these people already told me I ain't going there. I don't want to start in the hole. So that's the whole reason we do jury selection. We want a level playing field. So I really wanted to share that with people because that underlying difference, and let me add one other piece to it. It's not just valuing damages. The other place you can explain it to the jury if you need to, I kind of touched on. It's assessing believability of witnesses. You can it's like the analogy that I've added in at the beginning of if you had a prosecutor who's trying to prove a serious crime. And in order to get a conviction, the jurors needed to believe their witness, his star witness. And star witness was a police officer. And one juror was a person who tended not to believe police officers. The other one tended to believe police officers more than other people. They could listen to the exact evidence at the exact time. One of them would say, didn't believe him, not guilty. The other one said, believe him, guilty. Both are fair people sitting shoulder to shoulder in the same jury box. It's not as simple as a dispute over facts. It's a dispute over conclusions from facts. And it's in the space between the facts and the conclusions where that bias can have an unintentional but nonetheless meaningful impact. That analogy goes to the second example of where the bias is, where the thing you're concerned about is more susceptible to bias. Damages are more susceptible because it's a weighing process, not a yes or no. Same thing in weighing believability of witnesses. So if you have that and you say, listen, this is a case with conflicting facts and evidence, they're arguing different conclusions. They're going to say our witnesses aren't believable. They're going to say ours are, and we're going to say the opposite. So there's another example how you can explain to the jury how bias can come into play in the most fair-minded person. Because because people all think if you're right, I don't care, I don't like your case. Once you explain to a judge, when you're arguing your cause challenges, or to the jury, you explain there are parts of this case, not all of it, but parts of it that are particularly susceptible to bias. People that are fair-minded jurors will go, well, that makes sense. You know what? This is an honor system, and this isn't for me.
That's incredible. I love the analogies and that story of how you crystallized all of this. How has your idea of explaining and teasing out biases evolved over time in your career?
Dramatically. In an earlier podcast, I talked about my dad coming to see me and how I did not handle jury selection well because that part of our practice had not evolved. Just like medicine evolves over time, you know, people used to die of things, now they don't die of. I mean, things get better over time, thank God. So does what we do. Our craft gets better too. And what we do in jury selection, I've contributed and a whole lot of other folks have contributed. There's a guy named Jay Burke who got me started down that path, who was a jury consultant. A lot of people have contributed to.
Did you extract any specific lessons? You mentioned that guy.
Yeah,
Did you extract anything specific?
Yeah, it's this idea that taking someone who's clearly biased and trying to change their mind is probably a waste of time. Now, there is now we're getting into some really difficult discussions with no clear answers. Where is that line with your bias beyond repair? And where is it where you have a subtle bias, but you know what? Like we've been talking about, teaching people about the fullness of pain, telling the real story of pain, teaching people that this process that may at first reaction sound like ambulance chasing is really a valid, good process, civil justice. Who is open to a change of heart and who isn't? I err on the side of I don't really know, so if there's a bias, I'm going to eliminate it. I don't want to take a chance. Maybe you can. But there are times you don't have a choice. You're going to have to take some people that have said some things that indicated some bias. And so you pick the ones you think that are most open to being shown a different path. And then you better be ready to show them the right path because they're already inclined against you. So you've got a higher hill to climb, but when you're right, you're a pretty good climber. So when I was younger, I didn't appreciate the bias. I thought, man, I open my mouth and tell them if I'm right, we're going to win. I just thought I was naive. I thought if we're right, I don't care what their opinions are, we're going to win.
Huh. Interesting.
And I know better than that now. So, but the more you can articulate in an understandable, logical way to the jurors, prospective jurors, why, honestly, their bias might impact them. And that doesn't make them an unfair person or a weak-minded person. We all are that way, depends on the subject. Then they're okay in this honor system saying, yeah, I got a bias and it might impact me, honestly. And once they say it, then hopefully the judge ultimately will take them off and you'll end up with a fair trial. And the more you can explain it in an easy to understand, logical, fair way, unassailable way. Who's going to disagree with what I just said? I'd like to hear the damn argument. It don't exist. But someone will try. It's going to be a BS. Then you can explain it to the court. And they're going to be judges going, nah, and we've all seen it. I've seen it too many times. I won't say where, it wasn't this judge, but I've seen it this year, 2 different judges. Nine, just was there. Thank goodness we won both the cases. But
Heck yeah.
But somehow overcame it. I still don't know quite how. But the more you can educate the judge, the more likely they're going to grant the cause challenges. So all of this stuff is extraordinarily important. It all goes into that mastering the art of establishing valid cause challenges.
Mindful of the time as we wind down the episode, is there any closing thought you'd want to impart on people as we close this subject?
Yeah, when it comes to jury selection and establishing cause challenges, respect for the jurors is so important. They aren't the enemy. I used to, when they were biased, it made me mad at them. And I realized, quit being. There are things that if I were sitting there, I'd be biased against it. And then when they resist saying the words need to be said to establish a valid cause challenge on the record, I used to think, well, you're just being pig-headed. And there are those people. They're just, I don't care. My mind is like a steel trap, and I'll separate it all. I'm thinking, you're kidding yourself. Or they're lying in wait because they're, trying to tank your case because they're mean-spirited. But those are rare. The vast majority of people who resist acknowledging their bias are doing it because they don't understand it. So the gem or the pearl out of all of it is respect them. They're not bad people, and they're probably not giving you a hard time. And take the time, if you treat them with respect and you talk to them with that basic understanding that they don't live in a courtroom. It isn't their job to understand how subtle bias can have a big unintentional impact. But if you can explain it in terms, they go, I get it. That makes sense to me. Your chances of them opting out are much better. And when they leave, I can't tell how many people that I've established a cause challenge with. And when they leave, they pass me by on the way out when they're excused, and they look at me and they nod, and it's a friendly nod. We're okay. You didn't disrespect me. You're not treating me as an unfair person. I understand. I don't belong on your case. I'd pick you as my number 1 juror in a different kind of case. And so let's never get so wrapped up in cause challenge it becomes a war with the jurors. Those people have been drug in there, and they're doing their best. Let's keep that in mind.
That's really cool. Thank you.